What are the benefits of collaborating with other podcasters? Should you even collaborate with other podcasters? And what I mean by podcasters, you're just talking to other podcast hosts. I have my podcast, they have their podcast. Should we collaborate? Does it make sense? Why would we want to do that? That's what I want to talk about in today's episode. If you're watching on YouTube or if you're listening to our podcast, the first benefit is you get your expanded audience reach. And what I mean by that is that podcasting we've built up our audience over the last 7 years. And if you're someone else, say another podcast host, you've been in also 7 years, you've taken the time to build out your audience. Now, let's say we're going to go out and do a podcast swap, which means I'm going to go on that individual's podcast. They're going to come on my podcast. We both get the benefit, and there's not so much of a one sided relationship. We get the benefit of he gets to come onto my podcast, I get to go on his podcast. Then we get the expanded audience reach where by me going on his podcast, I get to tap into his network that he's built over 7 years, or their network, I should say, whether it's male or female host. And conversely, if they're coming onto my show, they get to tap into our audience that we've built over the last 7 years. So you get to have that expanded audience reach. You find that there's networking opportunities. Maybe you find that you really click and you want to do a monthly live Q&A together on your certain niche that you're talking about. Maybe there's just an opportunity for you guys work together where maybe you put together a real estate deal, or they need help on something, or you need help on something. You just really never know what's going to be coming out of a podcast interview. But there are these networking opportunities. I find that if I'm going to a networking event, I go there, maybe it's a conference, maybe it's not a conference, maybe it's a local RIA, and there's 100 people there, 50 people there, and it's only an hour or two, say 2 hours. It's going to be hard to get to really know everyone on a deeper level. You're just going to go through, hey, how's it going? What's your name? What do you do? What are you looking to do? Just that type of thing. Just it's going to be very simplified. Maybe you get a business card, then you're on to the next one. It's almost like, you're just going through the routine of just meeting everyone. Then by the end of the night, you have 30 business cards. You can't remember all the conversations that you had. That's where the podcasting comes into play, where now I get to talk to him for 30 minutes on my podcast. He gets to talk to me for 30 minutes on his podcast. Now you're going to get that benefit together, and you're going to have that networking opportunity where you really get to dive deep into your story, what each one of you does, and there's just going to be that increased networking opportunities. Sometimes I go on a podcast and the podcast host comes on my show and there's no networking opportunities for that's just how it is. But you never know until you start having conversations and putting yourself out there and talking to these other podcast hosts. And then the last bit of it would be collaborating with other podcasters would be building increased credibility and trust. And this isn't to say, hey, I heard this individual on a podcast, he must be very trustworthy. I've seen people in the real estate space where they are on, like, I know I run a podcast booking agency, but I've even seen folks, hopefully they haven't been our clients, but where they just go on a ton of podcasts. You think that they're building that credibility and trust, and you find out that they're just getting hammered in the real estate deals. They have capital calls going on. And that's not what I'm talking about here. I mean, for every one of those, there's probably 9 other folks that are doing a good quality job. And that's what I'm talking about here, where I'm coming through and I'm building that credibility and trust. And the reason I tell you that is I don't want you to think just because you heard someone on a podcast, even my podcast, or I shouldn't say my podcast, or a YouTube channel. But my goal is to build the credibility and trust by doing these podcast interviews, by doing these solo episodes, to build that credibility and trust with the audience. But at the end of the day, you have to be the one to make your own judgment. And there's so many people out there that do go on these podcasts that are successful in some form, but maybe in this particular state of their journey, just aren't seeing that success. So again, just take it with a grain of salt when you hear someone on a podcast. Always just make sure that you're going through and doing your due diligence at the end of the day. But with that said, it does help you build that credibility and trust with an audience where I'm going on someone's podcast, they're coming on my podcast, but say for this sake, I'm going on their podcast, their audience says, oh, I've been listening to this podcast for 7 years. I really enjoy the content. Every time this host brings on a guest, I'm going to trust in that guest. I'm going to enhance their credibility because that podcast host is bringing that individual on the podcast, and it does allow you to build that credibility and trust, which is what you want. I mean, it's hard to make a sale. It's hard to find a new investor if someone doesn't trust you, if you don't have that credibility. But again, just from my experience being within the real estate space, and I'm a passive investor, so I'm always trying to look and network with new individuals. And I just heard a couple of times different podcast hosts out there where from the outside looking in, they seem very successful. They look very successful. And for whatever reason, their real estate deals just aren't that great. Maybe they were a host themselves. Maybe they wanted to just go on the podcast circuit, whatever it may be. You just want to make sure you're always doing your due diligence. And I found that was the biggest aspect of being a passive investor. But not to go down too far down that rabbit hole, being collaborating with other podcasters does allow you to build that increased credibility and trust. And just again, quick recap, outside the credibility and trust, it allows you to expand your audience reach and to increase your networking opportunities.